Hello everyone, my name is Julianna Zinchenko and welcome to my fashion school. On this channel, you will find a ton of sewing content from Sew With Me videos to sewing tutorials, but that's not all we talk about here at my fashion school. And if you've seen my video essays, you know that. Welcome to lesson 3 of our pillowcase series we got going on this week. I talk about in lesson 1 why the pillowcase is the perfect beginner sewing project, so I had to do a whole series on it for you guys. And it's also so fun and such an easy way to spruce up your home or your bedroom. So I have 2 options for you guys. I'm going to be teaching you how to sew an envelope pillowcase and then a pillowcase with an invisible zipper. I'm going to be showing you guys 3 different ways you can sew an envelope pillowcase, and then with the invisible zipper, there's just one way to do it. Our last 2 lessons, I taught you guys how to sew an envelope pillowcase using a square pillow. This time, we're going to learn how to do an envelope pillowcase using a longer rectangular pillow. And then I'll also be showing you how to do this very beautiful detailing along the edge. The reason a square pillowcase is different from a longer rectangular pillowcase is because a square pillowcase, the flap is in the middle. With a longer rectangular pillow, if we put the opening in the middle, it would be pretty tough to get the pillow in, so we put the opening close to one of the sides. Here is another example. I love this one. I think the detailing is just so cute and girly, and especially if you use like a very beautiful silky fabric. I'm the biggest believer that you should surround yourself with beauty. Beautiful art, beautiful flowers, beautiful pillowcases, beautiful fabrics, beautiful furniture. Your environment is so important. It's your sanctuary. It's where you are every day. And putting effort into it and surrounding yourself with beautiful things to look at, it makes a huge difference, I promise you. After this video, if you want to catch up on this series, I have 2 more lessons before this one, so go check those out. And without further ado, let's get into the rectangle envelope pillowcase tutorial. But don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell button to know when we have class next, like, share, comment, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Julianna Zinchenko for more fashion and sewing content and much, much more. All right, first let's go over what we're going to need. We're going to need shears, which are fabric scissors, polyester thread, fabric chalk, a pillow, of course, pins, a measuring tape, and a clear ruler is optional, but it definitely helps, and some fabric. Step 1, we are going to measure our pillow. We're just going to measure edge to edge. And I just want to clarify that the longer side of a rectangle is the length and the shorter side is the width. It's very important to keep in mind, when I make a pillowcase, I do not account for seam allowance. Basically, what that means is you don't add any seam allowance. So if I have a pillow that is 20 inches by 20 inches, that's exactly what I'm gonna cut my fabric out to be. And then you'll see in the tutorials, my seam allowance is always 1/2 inch. So we still have a seam allowance, of course, but we don't add any extra fabric. If you're confused, don't worry, it will all make sense when we get into the tutorial. The reason I don't add seam allowance is because I've noticed that when I do, the pillowcase seems like it's too big for the pillow. It just doesn't end up fitting right. And when I don't add seam allowance, it fits the pillow perfectly. So I highly recommend never adding seam allowance when doing pillowcases. But this is just my personal preference. You can account for seam allowance if you want to, and your pillow will still end up looking very nice. All right, let's get into calculating the measurements for our pillow. We're going to do the front piece, which is very easy. You just take your measurements of your pillow, and I'm not adding extra fabric for the seam allowance, so that's why my measurements are exactly what my pillow is. If you want to add seam allowance, all you have to do is add 1 inch to both measurements. The reason we add 1 inch is because our seam allowance is 1/2 inch, and one side plus one side equals 1 inch. I'm not accounting for seam allowance, so I'm going to bring my numbers back down to 27 and 20 inches. Now you can stop here, but if you want to add the pretty detailing along the edge, you're going to add 4 inches to both measurements. So mine is 31 inches by 24 inches. The reason we add 4 inches is because our detailing along the edge is 2 inches wide, and one side plus one side equals 4 inches. And that is it for my front piece. These are my final measurements. Now we're going to move on to the back smaller piece. So what I'm going to do is take my pillow's length measurement, divide it by 3. Now keep in mind, if you're accounting for seam allowance, you want to go off the measurements where you added that 1 inch. So for example, I would take 28 inches and divide it by 3 here if I was accounting for seam allowance. But since I'm not, my measurement is 9 plus 4, and that will give me 13. But then, since I'm adding the pretty detailing along the edge, I'm going to add 2 inches. And the reason we only do 2 inches this time for the detailing is because for the back pieces, one side is hemmed and then the other side will have the detailing along the edge. So you'll only need to add 2 for that one side. And that will bring me to 15 inches. And then for the other measurement, all you have to do is take the width of your front piece. So my measurements for my back smaller piece are 24 inches by 15 inches. Moving on to our back larger piece, I'm going to take my pillow's length measurement, divide it by 3. Now again, if you're going to account for seam allowance, you want to go off of those measurements where you added 1 inch. So here I would do 28 divided by 3. But since I'm not accounting for seam allowance, I'm going to do 9 plus 9 plus 6, which will give me 24. And I'm going to add the detailing along the edge, so I'm going to add 2. So that brings me to 26 inches, and then for my other measurement, again, it is just the width of my front piece, which is 24 inches. And here are the final measurements for my 3 pieces. These measurements right here are for the overlap and the hem, and these measurements will give us an overlap of 7.5 inches. You can always increase these numbers if you want a bigger overlap, but I recommend these measurements. Alright, moving on to step 2, we're going to cut out our pieces. It really doesn't matter which direction you cut, but if your fabric has a pattern on it, like mine does, you want to make sure that you're cutting out all the pieces so that the pattern will be going the right direction when your pillow is finished. For step 3, we're going to hem the 2 back pieces. And I'm going to lay out my pieces as if I was about to sew the pillow together so that I know which side of my pieces I need to hem. And as you can see here, before I put these pieces right sides together, I'm making sure that the pattern is going the same direction. So the side that is in the middle for both pieces is the side I'm going to hem. And then I'm going to take my 2 back pieces and make sure they're right side up. Then we're going to draw 2 fold lines. The first one will be 1/4 inch from the edge, and then the second one will be 1 1/4 inch from the edge. Then you're going to fold at that first line and iron it down. This is optional, but I always love to go in with a tailor's clapper to make it nice and flat. Then you're going to fold at that second line we drew and iron it down. Then you're going to sew a straight stitch as close as you can to the edge there. And don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. And no matter how experienced you are, it's always a good idea to pin before you sew. And then a pro tip for y'all is to always practice on a smaller piece of fabric before you start sewing so that you can check that your stitches are coming out nice and that the tension is correct and everything like that. Then you're going to lower your needle so that it catches the bobbin thread. And you want to make sure that both of these threads are underneath your presser foot and are going towards the back of your machine. And a little pro tip for this pillowcase is when I top stitch, I increase my stitch length to 4.0. Sometimes I'll even go up to 5.0 because I feel like it gives the pillow a more luxurious look. Then I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric there with the edge of my presser foot so that it will act as a guide and it will help me sew a straight line. And then I'm going to figure out where I want to position my needle. I'm going to move it left to right. And I'm even going to drop it in my fabric just a little bit to see where the stitch is going to end up. Another thing I want to mention is, have you ever started sewing and this has happened at the beginning of your stitch? It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it's just not cute. I'm going to show you how to prevent it. You're going to want to hold the top and bottom thread taut as you sew the first few stitches, and then you can drop them. Now, of course, I usually use a thread that matches the fabric, but for the sake of this video, so you guys can see, I will be using white thread. You should try to get as close as you can to the edge, but not so close that the needle doesn't catch the fabric. And voila, this is what it should look like when you're all finished. And the beginning of my stitch looks nice and clean using my little trick. And then I'm just gonna iron down both hems. Make sure you clip off the loose threads, and then we're going to move on to step 4. Using fabric chalk, we're going to mark the 1/2 inch seam allowance on both back pieces. The reason I like to do this is because not only does it help us sew a straight line, but it also helps us sew a perfect 90-degree corner. Also, this is a pro tip. I noticed that my fabric has some stretch going in one direction. So what I'm going to do is a stay stitch, which is basically just sewing a straight stitch on that one layer of fabric. And I'm making sure I'm sewing it so that it would be inside of the seam allowance. And this helps your fabric not stretch out as you're sewing it. Moving on to step 5, we're going to put our pieces right sides together and then sew along the edge. And before I put my pieces down, I like to lay them next to each other, check that the pattern is going in the same direction, and then I flip it over. This is what your marking should look like, and then as you can see, I'm also gonna mark where the overlap ends underneath so that I know where to backstitch when I'm sewing, which I will get to in a moment. This is what my marking looks like. I just marked where the hem begins and ends. And then you're just gonna sew all the way around, and the seam allowance is 1/2 inch, and then the lines in bold is where you're going to backstitch. You not only want to backstitch at the corners, but you're also going to want to backstitch where the overlap begins and ends, because those parts will experience a lot of tugging. And I'm pinning before I'm sewing, especially because this is a bigger pillowcase. So what I'm going to do is align the edge of my fabric to a line on the throat plate, so it will help me sew a straight line. And then y'all know the drill, we've done this before. I'm gonna move my needle left and right and then lower in the fabric a little bit to see if it's hitting that 1/2 inch line. And I'm gonna get to sewing. Don't forget to hold your threads taut when you're first starting your stitch. And then don't forget when you hit the beginning and the end of the overlap to backstitch at both those parts. And then here's a pro tip for y'all. This is something that I've noticed when sewing the envelope pillowcase is sometimes as you're coming up on that hemmed edge, the presser foot can like push it so that it creates this like hump, and then if you just keep going it can end up looking weird. So what I do right before I approach it is I lift my presser foot and I flatten out that hemmed edge so that it's underneath the presser foot, so that when I sew over it it'll be nice and flat and not weird and humpy. Then you want to go all the way up to the point of that corner, and then you're going to backstitch, go right back to it, and then you're going to lower your needle into your fabric. It's a very important part. Lift your presser foot, swing your fabric around, and line it up with the same guideline you were using before, and then continue sewing a little bit, backstitch to that corner point, and then continue the rest of the way. Also, never let the speed of my clips fool you. I take my time when I'm sewing, and so should you. This is what your corner should look like, a perfect 90-degree angle, and then a back stitch as well. Actually, I'm going to backtrack on that, the word perfect. Do not stress about your projects being perfect because it ruins the fun. It's nice to get super straight lines and crisp corners and all of that, but at the end of the day, sewing should be fun, and don't stress too much about it.
Summer should be fun.
Moving on to step 6, we're going to clip the corners, and the reason we do this is to reduce bulk and make sure that our corners are nice and pointed. And I'm going to taper it, and I'll show you what that looks like right here. And for step 7, we're going to finish off the raw edges of the seam allowance either using pinking shears, a serger, or a stitch on the sewing machine that mimic a serger stitch. And here I have a couple options for you on the side if you just are using a sewing machine. Since we are top stitching to create that detailing along the edge, we actually won't see any raw edges on the inside. So I'm just going to make it easy for myself and use pinking shears. And this teeny part right here that I didn't cut with pinking shears, I'm going to finish off with fray check. If I were to do this over, I probably would have just started clipping the corners with pinking shears. Next, we're going to take our pillow and turn it right side out, and then go in with a point turner for the corners. And I just want to show you guys how I push out my corners. I have one finger on the inside, and then I use the other one on the outside to push it through. And that will get me close to a 90-degree angle, but that is why I go in with a point turner. Tell me that 90-degree angle isn't so satisfying. Then for step 9, before we do our top stitching, we're going to iron down the edges. What I do is I use my fingers to shimmy the fabric until I get right up to that seam, and then I will iron it down. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the corners. The edged detailing is going to be 2 inches wide, so I'm going to measure 2 inches from the edge. You can mark 2 inches all the way around your pillowcase, but I usually don't like to make too many markings on the right side of the fabric. And I'm going to use the lines on my throat plate anyway as a guide for these 2 inches. I just like doing corners so that I get that perfect 90-degree angle. Alright y'all, we are in the home stretch. Now what we're going to do is top stitch 2 inches from the edge all the way around. And don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. Also, another thing that I did was pin down the overlap part around 2 inches from the edge so that it stays flat as I'm sewing. I also check if it's flat and in place right before I'm about to hit it when I'm sewing, which, if this doesn't make sense now, it will once we continue this video. What I'm going to do is use the edge of my throat plate as a guide. It is about 2 inches from the needle, and I'm going to make sure that I position my needle so that it is perfectly 2 inches from the edge. I'm just going to drop it down into the fabric a little bit to see where my stitch is going to end up. Then I'm going to make sure I hold my thread taut as I sew the first few stitches, backstitch, and then sew the rest of the way. And then for the corners, you know the drill. You want to lower your needle into the fabric, lift the presser foot, swing your fabric around, and then drop your presser foot and continue sewing. And then since I'm sewing this with the front piece facing up, I just need to be aware where my overlap starts so that it's nice and flat when I sew over it. And then when you're all finished, don't forget to backstitch. And then I actually swung my fabric around and backstitched again over the first backstitch that I did, just to be extra safe. Don't forget to clip your loose threads, and we are all finished. This is what I was talking about by making sure your overlap is nice and flat as you sew over it. And the only thing we have left to do is put our pillow in our brand new pillowcase. Ugh, this pillowcase is stunning. I don't want to pick favorites, but this is probably my favorite lesson out of my pillowcase series. I'm just absolutely obsessed with the detailing along the edge.
Alright class, that is it for our rectangle envelope pillowcase tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to know when we have class next. And stay tuned, we have one more lesson this week. Our last lesson is not an envelope pillowcase, it is how to use an invisible zipper, so you're not going to want to miss that one. If you want to catch up on the lessons this week, I have 2 more before this one, also on envelope pillowcases, so go check them out. Class is dismissed. I will see you in our next lesson. Mwah.